Good morning again, everyone. And we are in our third week of how to be a perfect Christian. This week, we're going to be back in the book of Galatians. We are actually going to touch on some of the area before the scripture that we had from 2 weeks ago. We were in Galatians chapter 6, verses 11 through 18, and today we're going to be in verses 1 through 5. Now, when we look at today's book of Galatians, and we're in those first 5 verses, Paul's giving us a breakdown of what it means to be in relationship with one another. And it's about being vulnerable and being open. And we're going to break down some of those pieces that Paul gives us today. But I sometimes wonder when we talk about being vulnerable and open in the church, I kind of wonder how many times do we look at the people around us and we realize that we can't seem to find a relationship there, that perhaps we're not quite as connected as we would like to be. You know, when I think about relationships and vulnerability in the church, I sometimes think about folks who would come through the doors and maybe for the first time, maybe for the second time, and they walk through the doors and it's like going on a first date. Now, if you've ever really been on a first date, preferably, even a blind date, even more so, you know that when you're on this date, that you try to impress the other person, right? You don't try to go in with your jogging pants and your hoodie and your flip-flops. When you go on a first date, generally you go in with your best dress or your best outfit, dress pants. You're going to take the other person, if you're the one running the date, so to speak, you're going to take them to a nice place, a nice dinner. Maybe you'll go out dancing. Maybe you'll do a nice movie, whatever it is. But you put your highest standards out there. You put those things out on the table, and you want to make sure that you impress them so much that they don't know anything else about you, that they just know your best. And even during the conversation of the date, you don't talk a whole lot about your personal life, maybe bits and pieces. You talk about different things that make you look good, maybe what you do for a job, maybe how your life has gotten to the point that it is, and you talk about those things in high standards, and you try your best to impress. And if you're on the other side of the table, maybe you laugh a little bit extra at the jokes, maybe you seem really engaged and authentic and you want to be really connected to the person on the other side. If you're attracted to them, whether it's physically or emotionally or whatever it might be, you don't want to make that bond break. So you do your best to make sure that they're getting an impression of you that means that you are connected to what they're saying. And that conversation goes back and forth over the course of the night. And then maybe at the end of the night, you had a good date, you had a good time, and you're hoping for a second date, and maybe you give a hug or a kiss goodnight, and you want the best out of that too, because hey, if you screw this moment up, you might as well walk away and be a sad, sad man, because you don't want to screw the kiss up, you don't want to screw things up, you don't want to make it embarrassing, you don't want any of those things, so you try your best to ensure that you know where you want to be. And when we talk about first dates, after the first date is over, you go away happy or you go away disappointed. But as time progresses, you want to make sure that people understand how authentic you are. Maybe the second date, you get a little more personal. You give up a little more information. And each one of these conversations gets a little more loose. Because when you talk about different things in your personal life, you only go so far. And when you hit that line, well, you better stop, because you don't want to get too personal, because what if you say something that you don't really want them to know? Now, as the conversations get deeper and deeper and you become more authentic eventually, maybe it's 6 dates, 12 dates, maybe it's 6 months or a year from that first one, and all of a sudden you go from your best dress, your best outfit, the best restaurants, the best jokes that you have, and you put all that together and it goes away all of a sudden. And after that longer relationship has been evolving and time has come across, you realize that the best thing you got is maybe McDonald's and sweatpants and a sweatshirt. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. That means that your relationship has evolved to the point where the comfort is okay. And I hope that that relationships can go that route. That it's not always about being impressive and being on top of your game. That sometimes we need to realize that in our relationships with one another, that sometimes our best is not available. And I think about that with the church. When people come in, we always want to give our best. We want to talk our best. We want to welcome people. We want to make them feel right at home. We want to put our best, Sunday best on. We want to give our best worship. We want to do all of these things over and over again and offer our absolute best. And that gives them a great image. Something has attracted them to your church. Whether it's the people in the pews, somebody they know, maybe it's the building, maybe it's a ministry you've put on. Whatever it is, there's something that has attracted them through those doors, and you want to make sure that you keep that date going. But we also have to remember that over time, that relationship has to evolve. That relationship has to change to something different and something new. It has to evolve to a point of comfort. And sometimes that means that that conversation needs to evolve even further into something that we don't ever like to talk about. Being vulnerable and humbling ourselves to be willing to understand that we're all in the same boat. And that is what Paul brings us to today. Paul brings us Galatians chapter 6, and as I said, it's verses 1 through 5. And Paul says, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can go take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load." Paul gives us these instructions about being able to do good for all. Right? Paul starts off and he's writing this letter to the Galatians. It's Paul's in the book of Galatians is giving them all the stuff that they've done wrong. All the things that aren't quite right. And it slowly morphs itself into a conversation with the Galatians about, hey, once you get these things straightened out, this is the way you need to behave. These are the things you need to do, and that's what we find here today. And he says, "Brothers and sisters, if someone's caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently." Now there's something very, very delicate in here, and we need to abide by it truly. It says, if someone's caught in a sin, if you know someone's living in sin, if things aren't quite right, if that sinfulness is bleeding into their lives, if things aren't where they need to be, well, you need to help them out and gently restore them. Bring them back. Bring them back into a place where they can find themselves find that way out of that sin. And only do it if you are in the Spirit. And that's one of the caveats we need to make sure we pay attention to. If you're not living by God, if you're not in the Spirit of God, if you're not in the attitude of Christ, walk away. This is not about saying, I'm better than you. It's not about any of those things. It's about being able to say that I am in Christ today, and I want to be a part of your burdens. I want to be able to help you find your way out of that sin. And he says, if you do it, restore that person gently. So we need to be careful. We can't say, well, you've done these things, don't come near me. You've done these things, you can't be a part of this ministry. You've done these things, don't come to church. This isn't about pushing people away or separating them from our conversations. This is actually about bringing them in. Helping people who are dedicated to Christ and want to live a life for Christ, but have found their way into some kind of hole. It's about bringing them back into relationship with Christ and making it healthy again. And if you do it gently. Don't push them into it. Don't yell at them. Don't tell them what they're doing wrong. Don't say this is the way it should be. You say, I'm going to help. And it says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law in Christ. Paul is continuing this conversation, and he says, if you know somebody else's burdens, if you know somebody else who's fallen into this hole, help them out. You know, the examples for this kind of thing are all over the place. They're all over the gamut. But we can even go back to those situations where maybe two teenagers have made decisions and now there's a pregnancy. And their lives are turned upside down. And so often we're really good about saying, well, you shouldn't have done these things. Well, how about saying, look, I know that you didn't do right, but how can I help you out of it? How can I make your life easier? How can I show you the way through this? How can I be a guide and a spirit-filled love for you today? And that goes on. He says, if anyone thinks they are something that they're not, then they deserve themselves. If you think that you are better than those people who are sitting around you, if you think you're not full of sin, if you're not right with them because, well, they're doing their thing and I'm doing mine. If you think you're better or not broken or not sinful or any of those things, Paul says, get over yourself. You're just kidding yourself. There's nothing that you can do that makes you any better than anybody else. Paul wants us to carry each other's burdens, and in those actions, it's not about saying, well, I see what you did. I don't want you around me. It's about saying, I see what you did. I see where you're at. How can I pick up that load for you? How can I carry that burden for you? This is like Paul saying, look, I know that you're dragging that wagon by yourself. I see it pulled over, yoked over your shoulders, and you're pulling as hard as you can, and there's no way out of it. And it's about you walking over to that yoke and grabbing the other side and saying, I can pull you through. Or getting behind it and pushing and seeing how you can slide this massive burden, this heaviness on their lives, and push it to a point where you can help them get past the hill. It's not about loading more burdens on. It's not about saying that you're better than somebody else. It's not about any of those things. It's about being loving and vulnerable with one another as Christians and saying, look, I can come to anybody in my congregation. I can come to people that I love and know love me and say, look, I've screwed up and I need some help. And those persons who get the ask to say, what can I do to help you through it? And it says, hey, each one should test their own actions. They can take pride, then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. If we are willing to live by Christ, if we're willing to do Christ's will in this work, then we don't need to compare ourselves to anybody else. We don't need to worry about what anybody else is doing or how high and mighty they think they are or how perfect they think they are. It's about being in a relationship with Christ and using that relationship to be in a relationship with others. It's about being vulnerable and open and realizing that our relationships within a church building, within a congregation, aren't just about sitting in the pews feet from each other. It's about connections. It's about owning who we are and each other looking at those situations and burdens and brokenness and saying, look, I'm broken too. And Paul continues. He says, for each one should carry their own load. Now you look at this and you say, well, Pastor, you just told me that I should go help and pick up that yoke and walk with it. Well, yeah, you are. But I never once said, hey, you know what? You pick up that yoke and you let them sit down. You pick up those boxes and you let them sit down and take a load off. I said, you help them carry it. You help them walk through it. You help them get in the house, up the hill, whatever you want to use. You help them get to where they need to get. But you need to understand that you need to carry your own burdens. You can't just walk away from it and say, well, it's somebody else's problem now. Oh, I've done these things. I've hurt these people. I've created these situations. I've done these things. Well, it's not my problem. Somebody else can deal with it. It's about taking ownership of that sin. It's about taking ownership of that brokenness and those mistakes that we've made. It's about saying, look, I know what I did wrong. And I'm going to do my best to make it better, but I need some help to get through it. And see, all of these things that we do, all of this help that we seek, all of these relationships that we desire, we have to get past the first date. And it seems like Sunday after Sunday when people come in, that a lot of times it's like going through a first date all over again. This is my best. This is, hi, how are you? This is how I'm feeling. I'm feeling wonderful. It's a good day. Great things are happening. But sometimes those answers are just false. And if somebody comes to us and they're fighting those burdens, they're fighting those battles, and we do things, or we say that we're going to do things, we need to do them. When we fall into the traps of saying that I'm going to take care of these things, or I'm going to help you through it, and you just walk away and you forget about it, then perhaps we need to evaluate who we are. Because you know what? None of us are without sin. None of us are without brokenness. None of us are perfect. And we need to remember that as we serve one another. How many of us have said, well, I'll keep that in prayer? And so often the translation means, well, I have no intention of praying for you. In fact, I've already forgotten what it is that I was going to pray about. Why are you still talking? Or somebody says, hey, Lord willing, I'm going to do it whether the Lord wants me to do it or not, but I want to sound like I'm trusting in God. Oh, bless her heart. We are so much holier than that spiritual failure. It's incredible what they've done. Oh, I just don't really feel called to that ministry opportunity. So often what's going through your brain is that ministry sounds suspiciously like a lot of work and involves little to no reward. So I'll just wait for something more glamorous to come along. I'll hear the Lord's voice calling out to me then. Well, I'm just waiting on the Lord right now. Well, I'll get there when I get there. How about, I really feel like this is God's will for my life. Meanwhile, in the heart and in the brain, I'm sick of people pointing out all the glaring and obvious flaws in my path. So I'll just slap the handy God's will label on it and hope that people will stop critiquing me. Our lives are filled with mistakes and with burdens and with sins and with hurt, with pain, and somehow we need to find a way to move beyond that first date in our relationships with one another and move into a connection that is wholeheartedly full of love and care. No matter what we face, we all have different burdens. No matter what we think that we have in life, we all have different ways of facing it. And no matter what we do as Christ Church, we need to work on it together. May we support each other in our burdens and in our pains and in our weights. And may we find a way to pick each other up when we've fallen down. May we find a way to not condemn or to critique or to push aside those people who are sinful and desperately looking for help. May we find a connection, and may we find a way to say, how can I help? Those are the relationship Christ wants from us in our churches and in our congregations. And may we never be too full of ourselves to help one another. Amen.